Hello and welcome to Uncle Rick's Outdoor World. This channel is dedicated to the crafts and the art of camping. We're going to explain this in just a minute, but we wanted to welcome you. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy the content and we hope you get a lot of knowledge out of it. Thanks so much. Camping is like many other things in life. The more we do it, the better we become at it, the more enjoyment we get out of it. So when you start camping, you're going to be exposed to a lot of new things that you need to learn to do. Unless you've spent time outdoors, you've probably not done a lot of these things before. So you're learning new skill sets. After you learn skill sets for a while, I start calling them crafts. Just like someone who apprentices eventually becomes a craftsman or a journeyman, camping is kind of the same way. The more you do it, the better you get at certain skills, the more they become a craft. And after you put all those crafts together, you become an outdoorsman. Let me also clarify my use of outdoorsman. That includes women also, or anybody else. The crafts and the art of camping are learned by both sexes, and both sexes are equally as good at them. A good outdoorsman practices his crafts and makes camping look easy. It almost looks like artwork when you're watching it all happen. So my definition of the art of camping, simply put, is that when I go onto a trip and I do all the preparation and I do the trip and I come home and I'm unloading the trailer or the van or the car or whatever it is, I realize at that point that everything that I took I used and nothing that I took I didn't use. That's a really hard thing to do when you're camping, and so when it happens, it's almost like artwork. By the way, I've only accomplished the art of camping several times in my whole camping career. It doesn't mean that the other trips weren't fun. It doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy myself. They were a blast. All it means is that hitting the perfect usage of equipment, supplies, and food is very difficult to do. But it is something that I strive for on every trip, so that when I do hit that perfect spot, it really is something that I take a lot of personal pride in. So let's get started. We're going to talk about a very simple camping trip in this episode. In the following episodes, we'll go into much more detail about much more sophisticated and longer camping trips. But in the beginning, it's best to start with something very easy so everybody can understand it and see what components are necessary. We're going to go into a section now on planning. I don't have a lot of pictures on planning, so what I thought I'd do is just show you some pictures of the places that we've been, places that we've camped, places that we love, and places that we can't wait to go back to. And you can get a feeling for what camping's done for us. So we're going to start our sample trip by wet camping. And my description of wet camping is when we go to a facility to go camping that has running water, it has toilets, it has bathrooms, it has showers sometimes. It has a lot of the features that make camping very easy for a first trip. In future episodes, we'll talk a lot about dry camping. It's much harder to do, requires a lot more equipment and a lot more planning. So for right now though, we're going to start with wet camping and a simple trip. So when we say we want to go camping, the first thing we have to do is ask ourselves 3 questions. How many people are coming? How many days are we going to be gone? And what facilities are available for us when we get there? These questions are pretty simple when there's just 2 of you going out for a weekend. As you add people and you add days and you take away facilities, your planning starts to become much more complex. So for our first camping scenario, we're going to talk about tent camping. It's inexpensive, it's a simple way to start out, and it does give you all the benefits of camping. After we answer the 3 questions, we now start our planning process. The process that works for me may not work for you, but I'm going to explain how we've honed this process down after 50 years of practice. To make this trip easier, we're going to make it close to home, and we're going to guarantee good weather for the 3 days that we're going to be gone. So now the planning process begins. I normally break down a list into 3 different categories. I have equipment, I have supplies, and I have food. Here is what a simple equipment list might look like. You can add or subtract to this however you'd like, but this might get you started. These are very high-level, simple lists. My lists today are much more granular than these are. For instance, for the word tent, I have not only tent, but I have poles, stakes, ropes, floors, stoves, everything that's included with the tent goes underneath that heading. I will say that we didn't pick that trick up right away. We spent a couple of very cold, miserable, cramped nights sleeping in cars before we realized that every component to putting up a tent is very necessary to the happiness of your trip. You'll find that you'll make a lot of sub-lists out of the equipment list, supply list, and food lists. The one that jumps out at me is the kitchen list. The kitchen is very important to the happiness and success of the trip. We make sure that the kitchen list is gone over before we leave and everything is verified in the kitchen. Also, we keep it with us as we camp, and that way anytime we run out of something or need to add something to the kitchen, we make sure that it gets on that list. It does make camping harder if you had left all the openers at home or somebody took them out of the kitchen and didn't replace them. Supplies are items that don't really fit in equipment and aren't food. So these items normally are somewhat consumable also. This list shows toiletries as one heading. Everyone who goes basically has their own list, listing out their own toiletries and medications and things that they really don't want to forget that are going to be necessary for personal hygiene when we get out there together. Another list that you're probably going to want to expand on is clothes. Try to be specific when you're putting out this list. Kind of start with your feet and work your way up to your head. That way you'll probably not forget anything. But the clothes list often depends on where you're going and what the temperature range that you expect to find in those days at that location. The food list is simply an extension of the menu list. And I'm going to show you real quick how to start that for just a simple little trip. So here's a sample of a camping trip menu. I've started it out and I do it normally by day. Day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. So this is day 1 breakfast, and I've made it pretty simple with the normal things that you would have for breakfast. Lunch I made simple also, but dinner I put in a different format because we have to understand that when we're camping we have different calorie requirements than we may at home. So when you're going to spend time in the outdoors, you need to look at food as fuel. If you're going out to have a leisurely couple of days not doing a whole lot of activities, you don't need to put in a lot of fuel to your body. In future episodes, we'll talk a lot about calories as fuel. But for right now, a simple menu is going to be easy to prepare. On some of our trips, when we have a lot of activities or we're gone for a long time, our daily menus will be somewhere around 5,000 to 7,000 calories a day. When the boys were young, we used to have menus that looked like 10,000 and 12,000 a day. Lewis and Clark, when they were on their expedition, they figured 20,000 calories a day per man. So after you've firmed up your menu, then it's time to go through and start breaking down its components for your shopping list. This shopping list goes with me to the store. That way I can check off items and make sure I don't forget anything. I think you'll be surprised at how many items are on your first simple shopping list. Often when we cook at home, we don't think about all the little components that we grab to put together to make a meal. But when you go to start buying them individually and putting them on a camping list, all of a sudden you realize there's a lot of things that go into your food prep. So when we were new at this, when we went to the store, we would buy all the components that we needed for our food, plus we would buy all of the condiments that went with those components. So after a while, we ended up with a refrigerator full of condiments because they kind of don't go bad. And how many gallons of mustard do you really need? What we learned from this was all we needed to do was raid our refrigerator before we went on a trip, and most of our meal prep items that we needed were in there. So I'm going to finish up on food here so we can move along. But one of the tricks that we learned early on was if we're going on a short trip like a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we normally would buy food on a Thursday. Buying your food on a Thursday is good because you get your food fresh. You get to put it away right away in your refrigerator or freezer and get it cold again before you put it in the ice chest when you leave on Friday afternoon. We'll talk more in future episodes about getting your food ready for travel. It is an art. So I'm going to talk briefly about how we pack our food for travel. It's very important that you do this properly because if you don't, you'll end up with things like apple juice spilled all over the inside of your car, and I tell you, that is no fun. Hello. We've reached a point where I really don't have any photos to show you. Normally when we're packing, we're busy, so we don't stop and take photos of what we're doing. But we do see now the value of doing that. So in the future, we'll be taking some packing photos and some packing movies and be able to put them on here for you. But for right now, sit back, enjoy the dialogue, and we hope this helps. Since I have no photos of our food packing, I've included some pictures of our kitchens in different configurations for you to look at while you're listening to the dialogue. Please excuse any of the mess or clutter in these photos. I never took them to be published. I only took them for a reference for ourselves to how we set up different configurations of the kitchen, so please don't judge me too harshly. So all your food will basically break down into three different types. There'll be your dry food, your wet food, and your refrigerated food. So your dry items are things like loaves of bread, chips, all the items that are kind of bulky and you don't want them crushed when you get there. These items can be just kept in paper bags or shopping bags and added to the packing at the very end. That way they won't get crushed. They're easy to get out and put aside when you start unpacking. The next items are those that don't get refrigerated but contain liquids or canned goods or that type of an item. We like putting this group into clear containers, as you can see in this picture in my son Tim's camp. This way it lets us see what's inside. It lets us know the contents without having to dig into it and dig around. This also protects the food items. That way they don't get punctured and start leaking somewhere in the car or in the truck. This also saves a lot of time in packing and unpacking because everything's in the same place. Refrigerated items are more of a challenge because they have to be refrigerated, and ice chests are space suckers. We're always limited in the amount of space we have to work with in transporting our gear and our tribe from one location to another. This is where I'm going to segue and talk about ice chests for a little bit. It's normally better to have smaller ice chests than it is larger ice chests, and I'll explain why now. I made the mistake in the beginning of having large ice chests. This way I could put in my food and my drinks, and I thought it was a great idea. The problem with that idea is that you're opening the ice chest and closing it on a constant basis to get your drinks out, especially if one of those items is beer. So simply put, your ice only has so much cold built into it. And so every time you open the lid and then allow all the hot air from outside to come in, when you close the lid again, the ice then has to fight to cool down that hot air. This is very inefficient and it makes the ice work really hard. Consequently, it melts really fast. This is not a big deal in the scenario we're talking about, where I can just walk to the store and get some more ice. But when I'm dry camping and I have no ice available to me to purchase, this becomes a real problem. The easiest way to fix this on a small scale is to have two ice chests. One small ice chest just for your food, another small ice chest just for your drinks. This solution allows me to have a drink ice chest that people can get in and out of all day long and I don't have to worry about. It also ensures that my food is going to be kept cool and safe for consumption 2 or 3 days later. With good planning, I'm only getting into my food ice chest 2 or 3 times a day just before meal prep. I often hide this ice chest in an area that somebody looking for a beer isn't going to find it and open it up and root around inside of it, wasting all of my ice. In future episodes, we'll talk about ice management. As we're getting out on longer trips and we're far away from civilization and can't get ice, the ice management becomes very important. We're going to do a whole segment on ice chests just because they are very important to how well a trip goes and what kind of condition your food is in after multiple days of being outside. The longer your trips become, the more important your ice chest becomes. But in the beginning, if you just have a mediocre ice chest and practice good ice management, for these short trips we're talking about, they'll be just fine. There's no point in the beginning to overspend on very elaborate ice chests that'll keep your food cold for many days. You're not going out there for that long, so don't invest in something until you really know what kind of camping you're going to be doing. Ice management is a learned skill and a camping craft. We'll talk more about this in the future, but in the beginning, the most important things to do is make sure your ice chest is always in the shade. Don't let it ever sit in direct sun. Have a separate ice chest for food and another for drinks, and keep the one for the food hidden so that people don't mistakenly try to get into it looking for drinks. Now that we have figured out how we're going to pack our dry food and our canned foods, we need to figure out now how we're going to pack our refrigerated foods. When I first started, I used to load up ice chest with all of my refrigerated foods, and then I would cover the top with ice. I figured this was a perfect way to do it because cold goes down. But one of the other things that ice does is it melts. And so everything at the end of the drive out to where we were going that was at the very bottom of the pile was now soaked through and through. For some foods, this wasn't a real problem, like vacuum packed bacon. But for other foods like hash browns and butter, it really is an issue. So we started using Tupperware and containers to pack our food into that we didn't want to get wet. This made it so that our food stayed nice and dry and kept cold all at the same time. We also started using blocks of ice instead of crushed. Block ice works very well in a food ice chest because you're not getting into it a lot, and the blocks last a long time, keeping things cold. So now that we have all our 3 lists and we know what we're going to bring, we need to figure out now how we're going to pack all of this into a particular space and move it out to where we want to go camping. One of the things we started doing when we were first getting into camping was we would gather the lists and then start gathering all the items that were on those lists and putting them into a pile in the living room. This was often a shocker at first because we had no idea that those little lists would turn into so much stuff. This was one of the real benefits of getting the list together before we were ready to leave. It gave us several days to start honing down those piles to a realistic level that would actually fit in the vehicle that we were going to be putting them into. We had a tendency when we first started out to overpack. This tendency didn't go away right away, I have to admit. It took us several trips before we realized that overpacking was really wasting a lot of our space and time when we got there. So this is something that has to be worked on as you start camping more and more. So overpacking, simply defined, is bringing items that you don't use when you're out camping. This is made more complicated by the fact that when you're new and you're going to a place for a first time, you don't know exactly what it is you're going to be doing there or what items you'll need when you do get there. And because I always want to be ready for everything, I have a tendency to overpack. This is something that I had to learn and to think through so that I didn't continue this behavior. In the beginning, I often planned full days of activities. Every activity requires gear, and gear requires space. When we got home and looked back at the weekend, we would see that we brought way too many activities to do. We just didn't understand in the beginning how long things take to do, so we would overpack and overplan. The problem with overpacking is pretty simple. It means that you're packing items you're not using, you're transporting items you're not using, you're moving items around when you finally get to camp that you're not using, and you're putting them back in a vehicle, packing them, and bringing them back home, never having used them. That's really inefficient. Now, being inefficient doesn't sound that bad, except the trade-off for being inefficient is that all that time I spent being inefficient took away from all the fun time that I had to spend with my family and my friends and doing things that I wanted to do. So now that I've gathered everything into the living room and I've gone through my piles and I've pulled out things that I think I really don't need so I avoid overpacking, it may be a good idea to actually start doing a dry run of loading the vehicle. When I started camping, the vehicle that was going to take me out camping was the same vehicle that I was driving to work every day. So it wasn't practical to load it with everything in it and then try to work the week. Loading all your gear for the first trip will probably be the longest you'll ever spend on loading your gear. The reason for this is that you're kind of playing Tetris on your first packing job. You don't know how things are going to fit into the space that you have. You don't really understand the size of your space until you start putting items into it and you realize how fast it disappears. So it's a long process the first time you load something. After you've done a trip a few times and after you've loaded your vehicle a few times, it becomes much quicker because you know exactly where the main items of equipment and supplies go to every time. This being said, I didn't do this on our first trips, and often when we were supposed to leave at 6 o'clock, we ended up getting out of town more like 10. So I would suggest that you do a dry run of fitting your equipment at least into your cars or your trucks. Also, when you're loading this, you have to be aware of weight. We're going to do an episode on packing, but to start with, what you really need to be concerned with is making sure that your heavier items are in front of the back axle, meaning you don't want to put your big water containers hanging out in the very back behind that back axle. It will affect the handling of your car. As a guideline, you want to make sure that your heavy items are between your axles. On a short trip like we're doing in this scenario, this really isn't that big of a deal. However, just make sure for your safety of your vehicle that most of the weight sits in the middle of the vehicle. When I was starting out and I was packing into cars, I used to put items like sleeping bags, clothes, stuffable type items in the very back because those items were fairly light and they had a lot of flexibility to how I ended up shoving them into spots that I needed to put them in. If things get really tight in your packing, you can take apart one of your bags of groceries that you can lay on top of things. Keep the bag, that way when you get there you can just put everything back in the bag again and move it to where you're going to keep it. Packing is one of the learned skills of camping. It's something that'll help you throughout your life once you get the hang of it, but it isn't easy and it does take time to perfect. Try not to rush this. Think about it, look at it, analyze it, have fun with it. Because packing is a learned skill, don't be too hard on yourself at first when you can't pack properly or quickly. It will come if you keep after it and you keep working on it. I won't tell you how many hours I spent perfecting the pack out for this little trailer, but I will tell you now, after all that work, it only takes me 30 minutes to pack this trailer for a 1-week trip in the Sierras. So now that we're all packed and ready to go, where are we going to? On this scenario, we're going to a campground that sits right by a lake right here in Los Angeles. Our drive time from my house to the lake is about 12 minutes. However, this isn't going to be what your normal trip is, so we're going to talk a little bit about what to do about your drive as you head out, normally on a Friday night for a couple of days of camping. I learned early on that while we were making our drive out to our destination was a good time to get some dinner. That way, when I got to our campsite, all I really needed to focus on was getting out our lights, setting them up, and then setting up the tent and all the sleeping gear. I could wait and not have to set up the kitchen till the next morning when I had plenty of light and plenty of time. When I started having kids, I realized it was easier to start making food for them before we headed out, or stop in a fast food restaurant and grab them something on the road. This way it kept them occupied, happy, and it made it a much nicer ride going out there. A little tip for if you are bringing kids along, have something simple for them to eat on Saturday morning when they wake up. This way it'll keep them out of your hair and full while you're setting up the kitchen and getting ready to do breakfast prep. Now I want to talk a little bit about doing breakfast prep and making breakfast. It's usually, if you go out on a Friday night, the first meal that you're actually going to make on Saturday morning. We're doing several episodes on outdoor cooking, but for right now I'm just going to give you a couple of tips about breakfast based on the menu that we have made up for this trip. So here's a couple of tips to make that first breakfast easy. I used to take the eggs that I was going to eat in that first morning and crack them into a container and scramble them at home. Pre-cook your bacon at home also. Put it into a Tupperware when you're done. When you're ready, pull it out, and all you have to do then is warm it up. If you have a 2-burner stove, you'll probably have your coffee on one of the burners, and you're going to be cooking your hash browns on the other burner. If you trade out hash browns for fruit, your breakfast is going to be ready a lot sooner. Once your coffee is done, you can use that burner to start warming your bacon, and then put it into a plate or a bowl with a cover over it so it'll stay warm. Then you can follow up with your eggs. By this time, your hash brown should be about ready, so your whole breakfast will be hot and ready all at the same time. This is really important, and this is a skill, so you'll learn it over time. We'll talk about it more, but this should get you going in the beginning. So think about all the items on your trip that you can pre-cook or cook mostly before you get out there to the campground. The more you can do at home, the more you can package in Tupperware or baggies, the easier and faster your meal prep is going to be when you get to the other end. You'll start working with this idea and you'll see that you can take a meal like breakfast and basically have it ready in about 12 minutes if you get rid of the hash browns. Tricks like these don't compromise the quality of the food. They just get me out of the kitchen faster so I can go have fun faster so I can spend more time with my family. Dinners are sometimes different. We like making a big deal out of dinners, so we'll have multiple courses and everyone will be involved in their preparation. When you're cooking for 10, there's a lot of things to do in the kitchen before you're going to have dinner. So it becomes a social deal with everyone being in the kitchen or sitting at the tables near the kitchen, all involved in the preparations for making dinner. This is a very social time. It's often the first time that the whole tribe is together at the end of a day. It's great interacting with the grandchildren and listening to their stories of what they did during the day, and the feeling that we all get about participating in making something that all of us are going to eat, and we're going to sit down and enjoy it all together. These memories that I have for this time in my family, whether there's 5 of us or 17 of us, have been very, very special to me. So as we reach the end of episode number 1, part 1, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we have in mind for episode number 1, part 2. In the next part, we're going to continue our scenario camping trip. There's a lot of considerations to picking out your campsite, where you put your equipment, where you set up your different parts of it. So we're going to talk about those and why they're important to a good trip. We'll have some more tips on setting up your kitchen, on food prep, and how to make things easy and tasty for you there. We're also going to talk about beginning kitchens. The kitchens I have today are nothing like what I started with. The ones I started with were very simple, but they were very good, and so I'd like to show you some of them, so if you are just beginning camping, you'll get an idea for some very clever and very good kitchens that are available to you. We're also going to talk about some of the critters and the pests that might bother you while you're camping, so you can be prepared for them and not be surprised and unprepared for them. We're also going to spend a little time talking about camping etiquette. Because you're going to be in a campground in this scenario, there are certain things that you do and do not do when you're in a public campground. Most of these rules will seem like common sense, but when you're out there with other people, there are a set of rules and unwritten etiquette that is important to follow if you want to have a good camping experience. In our experience, we've found campers to be very nice people. We haven't had any issues with experienced campers, but sometimes the new campers make us want to break out our torches and pitchforks at night. And lastly, in this episode, we're going to talk about breaking camp down, putting away the equipment, packing it in your car, and taking it home. Also, we'll spend some time talking about the do's and don'ts about how to store your equipment and how to break it down so that it's ready to go for the next trip. I'm also going to give some demonstrations of how we start pre-planning for our next camping trip. Some of the websites that we go to that give us information on weather and wind, and some of the tricks that we've learned about planning and preparation. If you like what you saw today and you got some knowledge from it that you think will be useful to you in the future, please give us a thumbs up and please subscribe, because subscribing is the way that we know that somebody wants to see our content. These content takes quite a while to put together. I am an old dog. I'm learning a lot of new tricks doing this. So please subscribe and let us know, because that way we know that we want to continue to put out more content for you. We have 24 episodes planned. There's a lot to camping. There's a lot to explain, and we all hope that you benefit from it a lot. So subscribe. See you later. Happy camping.